All right, hi. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. This is our last book event of the spring before we take a break for the summer. So I appreciate everyone making time in what might be a very busy time in the semester for everyone as you're wrapping up. I'm Amanda Perry. I'm the executive director for the NACBS. I want to thank you all for joining us today to hear more about Windrush Cricket from Michael Collins. I am just going to briefly introduce our guests and then I will turn it over to them. Michael will speak for a few minutes about the project, and then Guy and Michael will have a discussion back and forth, and then we will open it up for audience Q&A. So there will be time for questions. Keep those in mind throughout. You can drop a question in the chat at any time, and we can turn to it once we open it for audience Q&A, or once we open the Q&A, you can just feel free to raise your Zoom hand in the reaction button. So. We are joined today by Michael Collins, who is Associate Professor of History at UCL. He has published on the political thought of Rabindranath Tagore, on nationalism and decolonization, on the rise and fall of federations in the British Empire, and on the significance of cricket in terms of imperial culture and post-imperial identity. He has been a permanent member of the UCL history staff since 2010. And from 2021 to 2024, he was a commissioner on the Independent Commission for Equity in Cricket. And so today we'll be hearing more about his recent publication, Windrush Cricket, Imperial Culture, Caribbean Migration, and the Remaking of Postwar England, which is out with OUP this year. He will be joined in conversation today by Guy Ortolano, who is professor of history at NYU. He works on urban history, intellectual history, and the history of science. And he is the author of such works as The Two Cultures Controversy out in 2009 and Thatcher's Progress in 2019. His current research, Supranational, asks how national historical writing has dealt with scales of reference and connection that exceed national frameworks. So I hope you all will join me in welcoming Michael and Guy, and I will turn it over to you, Michael.
Thanks so much, Amanda, and thank you to everybody online for joining. I really appreciate it. Okay, so just to open up, I'll speak a little bit about the genesis of the project and the kind of interventions that I wanted to make. I guess the genesis of the project goes way back, many years, to my first reading of C.L.R. James's Beyond a Boundary. That's C.L.R. James in the bottom right hand of your corner, right hand corner of the screen, I think. If I don't know if it's mirrored or not, but anyway, you can spot him there holding the book. Um, and put simply, I mean, Beyond a Boundary was one of the most astonishing books that I'd ever read as a historian, as an undergraduate historian, and student of political thought. It really has no footnotes, none of the kind of conventional scholarly apparatus, and yet the boldness and originality of his writing and thinking was incredibly striking. And one of the things that stayed with me for a very long period of time was his comments in the middle chapters of the book on what he called recent historians. I think he was referring to G.M. Trevelyan. This book was written in the 60s. Recent historians who'd claimed, in Jamesian language, claimed to have written a social history of the Victorian age, but had omitted to incorporate the most important Victorian of all. And that most important Victorian that he was referring to was a man called W.G. Grace, who embodied, in James's view, a kind of emergent modernity and a relationship between sport and culture, which James saw as being tremendously important in historical terms, but also very much applicable as a framework of analysis to the Caribbean. And that struck me and stayed with me. And in the context of more recent historiography, shall we say, about Black British history, imperial history, I was always kind of thinking in the back of my mind that this is a notable absence. There is a very rich literature in sociology about the significance of sport in terms of the constitution of human social practices and identities and so on. And there is actually a literature which is coterminous with or predates what we've referred to as the new imperial history emerging in the 80s and the 90s, which uses very similar kinds of methodologies to talk about the cultural and discursive or linguistic significance of sport. But those two literatures seemed to be rather separate. So the overarching intervention I wanted to make really was to sort of talk about the significance of sport and particularly the particularity of cricket in terms of imperial history, versions of Englishness over the longue durée, from, from the 18th century right the way through, in fact, to the present in terms of kind of various traumas and crises of Englishness in the 1990s and beyond. And indeed, and here's the heart of the book, the central role that cricket played in terms of enabling Windrush settlement in England after the Second World War. What I try to demonstrate through the sections of the book which are more social history than cultural history is how central the cricket club was as a space around which people gathered, shared information, enjoyed conviviality, food, common culture and language, not just playing the game, but in other words, the cricket club, the social club, as a core pillar, a foundational pillar of a new form of community and identity that was emerging in the post-colonial period in England. And I say England, of course, because the patterns of settlement are overwhelmingly in urban English spaces, and that English British thing is perhaps something that we might talk about later on. So those are, in a sense, the kind of overarching structures of the book. And at the end, in the latter stages, I try to suggest the shortcomings, as it were, of a sort of anti-colonial framework for thinking about cricket as national resistance or collective group resistance at the international level, and the complexity, ambivalence, and ambiguity of the post-colonial spaces in which very young children are migrating to England and becoming cricketers or playing the game, or indeed are born in England and are seeking to be black cricketers playing within the structures of the English game. And again, as a sort of a final point, I felt like I did detect a certain degree of intellectual snobbery at times about the significance of sport, that it's a sort of peripheral thing, and those who are writing about sport history should be doing it politely in sports journals rather than trying to kind of mainstream it. But what I wanted to show was how absolutely fundamental it was to the constitution of those post-colonial and national identities over time.
Oh, thanks, Michael. And hi, everyone. I'm Guy Ortolano, and I'm very happy to have this chance to kick off our conversation with Michael about this brilliant new book. Um, I have really so many questions, which include things like, um, how do you keep score in cricket? And why does it take so long? Uh, Not really. I know a little more than that. I've been dragged to many cricket matches by friends when visiting England. I thought I'd begin just by highlighting a couple of the questions that the back of the book poses, which I think do a good job of giving a sense of some of the problems that Michael explores. I'll add a third. One is, how did the so-called quintessentially English game of cricket come to be so important across Britain's Caribbean Empire? As the empire declined and gave way to complex patterns of migration, what part did cricket play in the life of the Windrush generation in post-war Britain? I'd be interested in taking or calling your attention to the way in which the book takes the story all the way into the 21st century, and also addresses problems about how we might understand the shifting place of Black Caribbean cricket in England since the 1990s and in this century. But what the book does, as you can tell from these questions and from Michael's introduction, is that it really takes cricket as a lens through which to rework a whole series of questions and fields and approaches in 20th century history, including Black British history, late imperial as well as post-war British history, social and cultural history, history of post-Windrush migration. Michael, I want to start off just by asking you to pick up on a point that you were making at the end of your remarks about we'll start with the most general before working our way in, and that is about sport, the historiography of sport. Um, I had seen Helen McCarthy somewhere in this Zoom, and Helen and I edited what was then 20th century British history together for 5 years. And I remember one reviewer, we sent an article to a reviewer, and that reviewer, who will remain anonymous, gleefully embraced the opportunity to take any opportunity to reject articles on sport. Uh, and I think I've always heard that kind of unreflective and vociferous denunciation of sport as a preoccupation of historiography has stuck in my mind. And your book really called it to my mind and made me think about it. And it made me want to kind of put it back to you and give you an opportunity to make the case, make a robust case for the value of integrating sport into social and cultural history.
Okay, well, thanks, Guy. I'm tempted to say maybe, the glib response would be that so many intellectuals have childhood traumas of being very bad at sport and therefore are instinctively rejecting it as a kind of category of meaning and analysis. There may be some truth in that, I don't know. Um, uh, let me, in terms of sort of trying to demonstrate the case then, as it were, let me perhaps take you back to an earlier period of imperial history and try to kind of substantiate a couple of points there. To answer the question, as it were, what can we see through the lens of sport, or in this case, cricket, that we couldn't see before? This is a picture of the Calcutta Cricket Club. You can see at the bottom there from 16th January 1861. But the club itself dates from 1792, which makes it just 5 years younger than the celebrated and famous Marylebone Cricket Club, the MCC, founded in 1787 in London, an iconic and kind of integral part of imperial Britishness. And what this picture does in terms of a kind of history of sport artifact, as it were, um, is a couple of things. It reminds us of the significance of the social club or the sports club as a space of congregation and conviviality for colonial settlers, in exactly the way actually that the Windrush generation used the sports club as a place to gather and a place for support. This is a well-trodden path, a well-established pattern which goes back through colonial history. So the cricket club becomes a kind of space of security, an island of white European solidarity in a sea of native otherness in these historical contexts. Um, and that performs a specific sort of social function, but also, for example, in the way that Mrinalini Sinha talked about that idea of clubbability in an article she wrote uh, perhaps some 20 years ago, created a kind of specifically colonial public sphere, a node or nexus around which colonizers would gather and establish their sense of community spaces to share information and so on. But I think one of the really significant things about this painting, this depiction, which is the Calcutta Maidan, the open spaces near Government House, is the glaringly obvious and therefore easily overlooked fact that cricket was a game which is played in very public and open spaces. You can't play cricket in private, or at least not very easily. You have to be, I think, fantastically wealthy to fence off your cricket ground. But the public performative nature of cricket was actually one of its most important facets. And of course, what we see very, very quickly is that native populations would gather, we were unable to exclude people from observing. And then in that kind of, I guess, in a kind of Homi Bhabha sense of the development of mimicry, of copying these forms and patterns of English masculinity, English gamesmanship, and imbibing the moral, even political codes which are embedded in the game. And the sort of protagonists of cricket, as it were very conscious that sport was pedagogy, that sport was the way in which character was built, character being a very sort of Arnoldian, Victorian kind of concept. You're not educating boys in this case in the Victorian period. You're not educating boys for knowledge, but to develop character. And so the public dimension, the spectacle of sport and particularly cricket was a way of communicating particular messages about Englishness, about masculinity, and about observation of rules, the rule of law, the umpire's decision is final, all of these types of ideas. So in other words, what I'm arguing there, almost from an intellectual history frame, is that ideas become embodied. The transmission of ideas is embodied in a physical activity, a non-textual kind of source. That was the sort of methodological um, insight that I was trying to bring across. But of course, this wasn't just about an outward projection either. What we also see with cricket is that it was a tremendously voluminous and I think quite influential way of communicating ideas about colonized people. So
Okay, there
this is a
I'm
post
reading now.
this is a
Proceeding.
postcard which was printed in 1912 and circulated across imperial spaces, depicting a game of cricket being played in Barbados by a group of children. And the sort of the important match is, it's obviously a kind of ironic twist on the idea that this game, the imperial game, is being imbibed. But the mimicry is clearly kind of imperfect, and the extent to which that is a subversion is possibly lost on the audience at this point in time. I think one of the key messages of this kind of artifact is that the game is spreading, but is spreading in a non-threatening way. It's a kind of disorganized, childlike format, and those themes about how colonized people play the game and how cricket expresses racial types is actually a fundamental and repetitive trope within the discourse of cricket. And that discourse is spread across the empire. So this is not just a kind of metropole-colony relationship. This material is spread across uh, all of the British territories, and that really accelerates from late 1932 with the advent of the BBC Empire radio service. And it's very striking how cricket is a common cricket commentary is a common subject for radio broadcasting in the 1930s. So what that allows you to do, whether you're in Birmingham or Brisbane, or Bombay, is to kind of lean into a colonial public sphere, to engage in the construction of a spatial imaginary in which cricket becomes part of an imperial shared culture. So what I'm arguing there, Guy, is that twofold, that sport is important and that ideas are transmitted through this embodied experience of playing and playing games, which, some would argue, and I think I would support, is inherent to the human condition. But also that it's something which constructs racial hierarchies across the empire to the extent that the inclusion of the West Indian, and here comes the specifically historical West Indian dimension, the inclusion of the West Indian in that brotherhood, imperial brotherhood of cricket-loving peoples, quote unquote, elevates them into a different kind of social category and creates distinctions between different types of colonized people. And if anybody's thinking about India at this point in time, why doesn't India feature in the book or in the story that I'm telling? Well, that's precisely because, as many eminent scholars have already explained, Prashant Kidambi would be a wonderful example. India doesn't embrace cricket as a popular sport until much, much later, far later than in the Caribbean. I'll pause there and let you. perhaps ask
Michael,
your
that
next
was
question.
that was you that was really interesting, and you actually worked your way towards something I had intended to ask about. So I'll just flag it as something being particularly interesting in the early part of the book, and then we'll move on. But one thing that you discuss early on that I thought was really illuminating is the way in which, although a trans-imperial phenomenon, the way in which cricket provides a way to think about the distinctiveness of the West Indian formation within the
Yeah,
empire.
right.
But instead of asking about that, because you've made that point, let me ask you about just to elaborate a little bit on the origins of the book, not in your UCL interview from 2007 or so, but rather can you relate it to seems to me like the moment when you returned to the book in the aftermath or in the context of the 2018 Windrush scandal?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you should say that, Guy, because actually, I mean, this is just an anecdote. But I remember during the Windrush scandal when it was sort of at its peak, and by the way, of course, it's still an ongoing kind of process. I mean, many people are still fighting for justice and reparations within that context of the Windrush scandal. But at its heart was a sort of an absence of documentation. You know, the bureaucratic, well, at its heart is racism, but in terms of the kind of, you know, the substance and paper trail of the scandal itself, it was about documentation and people being able to or unable to prove their residence and presence in England. And what the thought I had at that moment, and this is when the book was really being conceived, was how do we write about the Black presence in Britain? How, as historians, do we make Black subjects legible in particularly in my period, in the post-war period? And it struck me, and I should preface this by saying that this is in no way any kind of, criticism or attempt to diminish the significance of these subject matters. But it struck me that over the last sort of 10 years or more, we've become uh, overwhelmingly focused on histories of activism and often grassroots forms of politics, but forms of activism that try to bring to light, you know, anti-racist activities and critiques of the state and so on and so forth. And that is, of course, fundamentally important. And, you know, a huge amount of brilliant work has been produced in that space. But it just sort of made me wonder, you know, in terms of making other types of Black lives in Britain legible, you know, how do we need to diversify, or can we diversify the kinds of subjects that we bring to light? And just in a slightly flippant sense, I asked myself, you know, I wonder if the cricket scorecard and the match report is is evidence I was here. I was here, but we've never actually paid attention to the significance of those activities. So in other words, you know, there could be 15 years worth of documentary record, as it were, of someone's presence in England, all bound up in a world of cricket which was completely unseen by mainstream historians. Now, as I say, that's not a criticism. It was just an incentive to try and sort of push the boundaries a little bit and to ask about the significance of those social formations. The other form of community organization and social life, which I think sits alongside the cricket club, and by the way, they are often actually intertwined, almost literally physically intertwined, but certainly socially, is the church. And that struck me as being, it's not a book I'm going to write, but that struck me as being another topic of great importance and significance for the Windrush generation. The attempt to join uh, entirely white-dominated Anglican church congregations upon arrival, just as people attempted to join overwhelmingly white-dominated cricket clubs upon arrival. And here I can show you a picture of um, a man called Isn't Mackenzie, who was playing for the Mrs. Peak-Friends Biscuit Company in Bermondsey in 1955. The attempts to join white cricket clubs, um, which were then met, particularly by the later 1950s, with visceral forms of racial rejection and segregation, which then spawned the setting up of all of these cricket clubs. So actually, I don't know if you saw this or if it was clear to you at all, but that was a really just a sort of fragmentary thought that spurred me on to say, I would like to write about forms of social organization which are perhaps elided by this emphasis on political activism. Not to say political activism isn't important, but there are, of course, other things that people were doing, living, thinking, and breathing in post-war Britain.
I'm going to ask maybe a couple more questions before we open it up to the group. I know people will want to ask questions, but I want to ask at least two more if I can reserve that right. The first is about your argument, quite a sharp argument, Michael, that you make with regard to Windrush and the historiography. And so I want to give you a chance to kind of help everybody here, especially people who might not work in this area but who certainly
Yeah.
teach it. What is your, I don't want to say polemic, that makes it seem too illiberal, but what is your position, historiographical position
Yeah.
regarding the recent historiography of Windrush and your pivot in this book?
Okay, thanks. So just to briefly summarize then, in case some of you are not familiar, and I'm sure some of you are not, there's been a multifaceted debate in the historiography about British history and Black British history on the subject of Windrush. And in case you're not 100% sure about that, Windrush is a ship which sailed from Jamaica to London in June of 1948 and became a kind of iconic moment, which was claimed by lots of different people from lots of different political positions, as the sort of beginning, as it were, of a new multicultural post-war Britain. Now, it's kind of multifaceted and complicated, but one of the key points to bring out there is that a lot of historians have said that the focus on Windrush actually obscures our attention and understanding towards the longue durée presence of Black people in Britain, number one point. And of course, the earlier histories of slavery and imperialism. So it sort of foreshortens our historical consciousness and horizons. And in that sense, kind of, enables or opens the door to a rather more comforting post-war story about the rise of a progressive multicultural society. Now, I have huge sympathy with those arguments, and of course they go back a very long way. So Peter Fryer was when he wrote Staying Power in the mid 1980s. He famously and brilliantly opened that book with the line, there were black people there were black people in Britain before the Anglo-Saxons arrived, and he was talking about Roman soldiers who were from North Africa. Now, what I'm arguing is not that emphasis on the long kind of durée perspective on slavery and empire is wrong, far from it, but that it's not mutually exclusive in regards to an argument about the specificity of the Windrush moment. So to answer your question directly, Guy, what I've tried to argue is that we need to be very, very kind of granular and particular about our periodization of World War II and the Windrush moment. So on numbers, it's very clear and well known that in 1948, 1949, and 1950, only a few hundred people arrived from the Caribbean. So the numbers are very, very small. So we don't necessarily see, a huge transformation in terms of numbers with the arrival of that particular ship. And of course, as other critics have pointed out, prior to June of 1948, there were other ships that arrived. The Almanzora arrived in 1947. So Windrush has been kind of problematized as a shifting point or a point of departure. But what I think is more significant is to demonstrate that the Windrush generation, taken as a group of people in terms of, our understanding of historical change, transformed fundamentally what it actually means to be British in the post-war period, and therefore, of course, for our contemporary purposes. And what I'm trying to suggest, therefore, is that revisiting the Windrush concept and also the social demographic realities of increased numbers of immigrants during that period, it remains a very, very important thing to do, and something which we can do without excluding or deprioritizing those other longer term historical phenomena, slavery, empire, and the long-term presence of Black people in Britain. There is one sort of addendum really to put onto that, which is a concept that I use throughout the book and which I actually derived from my earlier work on Rabindranath Tagore, which is terms of inclusion. I use this phrase quite a lot in my book. And what I'm trying to do is to sort of disambiguate different forms of presence in metropolitan Britain of racialized non-white others, and ask not just about their actual presence and their activities, but also the terms under which they were present. In other words, who gave license to them to be there, and how did they see their own horizons of expectation? How did they see themselves as being present? How long did they think they were going to stay? Did they see themselves as being integral parts of metropolitan society, making new claims on Britishness? Or did they see themselves as sojourners who were present in Britain to perform a particular function and would then return? And actually, a lot of the cricketers, including during the Second World War, were of that sort of persuasion, that sort of idea that they were there to serve king and country, that they were there to perform particular functions, but they would be then returning to whichever Caribbean island they had come from. This man, Sir Leary Constantine, is a very, very good example of that. Leary Constantine became a celebrity cricketer. He was kind of feted and highly paid. Um, but actually saw himself ultimately as a colonial subject who was, despite his progressive views on racial questions, did not see himself as fundamentally transgressing the racial binary. He still saw Britain as a predominantly white country, and that people such as himself, after the Second World War, would be returning home. So, as the liaison officer for 10,000 West Indian workers in Liverpool, he was very clear and reiterated the point many times that when their service was over, they would be returning home. The thing about the Second World War and the diversity question is that after 1945, up to around 1948, um, Britain is very much whitened. There is a tremendous effort on the part of the British government, the Labour government of the time, to repatriate and remove people from metropolitan Britain who did not fit the white paradigm of Britishness. My point here is that many colonial subjects imbibe that idea. The break, the transition is with the Windrush generation. The Windrush generation is the first generation to shift from the sojourner to the citizen, with all of those struggles that came with it. But that is, in my view, a transformational moment in the nature of Britishness. And that's why I'm kind of revisiting that whole Windrush debate and trying to kind of once again say that this is actually a kind of watershed moment in, not a triumphalist one, but nonetheless a watershed moment.
So we have about nearly 20 minutes left, and I want to open up the floor now to questions. We have nearly 50 people in the Zoom, so I'm sure there'll be many questions. Amanda, Perry, I'm happy to give way here and let you help manage the discussion.
Sure.
But anybody, you can raise your hand or put your question in the chat.
Yeah, it would be easiest if you want to hit the react and then raise the Zoom hand, emoji. That'll bump you up to the top so we can see that you've got a question. If not, you can type it out into the chat and I will read it for you. But let's go ahead and get started with Lawrence. Do you want to go ahead?
Thanks very much, and thanks both of you Congratulations, Michael, on the book. Actually, the question is prompted by that the Leary Constantine image. Does the book discuss the Lancashire leagues and the role that those smaller clubs, so not county cricket clubs, played in not just for Caribbean West Indian cricketers, but for particularly for Indian and Pakistani cricketers. And again, it does. I was trying to think of all the various ways in which cricket, for obvious reasons, but still is a very sort of is a very useful platform for understanding race. And I'm sat here in York, so I'm
Mm,
thinking of the recent crisis in Yorkshire County Cricket Club, the last county to allow overseas players in. Its first overseas player was probably the greatest Indian cricketer, Sachin Tendulkar. All hell broke loose when he played. And the club has recently been found guilty of institutional racism. But so I wondered
mm,
about the kind
mm,
of smaller Lancashire League clubs.
mm. Yeah, thank you, Lawrence. This kind of question really speaks to the argument that I'm trying to make, and this is actually Leary Constantine playing for Nelson. You might be, I don't know if you can see the text box at the bottom. So Constantine actually made his fame and fortune as a club cricketer in the north of England. Many folks have said that that speaks to the the sort of supposed racial tolerance that may or may not pertain in different parts of the north, particularly in Lancashire. Um, I'm not so convinced about that, and I think this particular source is interesting in that respect. It's a source which is open to multiple interpretations. We actually don't know what these children are saying or thinking when they are kind of reaching out to touch this cricketer as he walks across the boundary and into the field of play. Um, but Constantine was a figure that sort of embodies the idea that cricket could elevate you above a certain social standing, and he performed that role in a very intentional and agent-centered fashion. So, for example, apart from just winning a tremendously large number of games for Nelson and making them the most successful club in the Lancashire leagues during the 1930s, he would also do things like come out during breaks in play and perform miraculous tricks with the cricket ball, or fielding tricks, throwing the ball miles into the air and catching it with closed eyes behind his back and this kind of thing. And the crowd would erupt and um, huge applause. Now, the reason I'm recounting that and telling that story is because I think it speaks to this idea that I've referred to already about terms of inclusion. So Constantine was licensed to be present as a performer and an entertainer. And there is actually, of course, a venerable and notable tradition of colonial subjects being given license to perform, particular kinds of roles in the metropole. Um, I mean, Brathwaite in his 1946, To Sir with Love, notices that in the immediate post-war period, there is a loss, an absence of everyday working class black people, but says that a few celebrities and entertainers, were hanging on. Um, and this is my point that Constantine played and others played in the Northern Leagues, but they did so under a very circumscribed kind of racial framework. So number one, they were just exceptionally good at what they were doing, and they won, a lot of games for the club. That would bring in huge gate receipts. And actually, at this point in time, Leary Constantine was the highest paid professional sportsman in England, not cricketer, sportsman. So he was earning more money playing cricket for Nelson than footballers um, were earning for playing for Manchester United or some other kind of club. However, when he was when it was kind of mooted that he might play for Lancashire County Cricket Club, there was there were howls of outrage, that it was absolutely impossible for a black man to represent Lancashire. So that is the nexus between race and identity that you already kind of put your finger on. But yes, the answer at a more simple level is that yes, there is a lot of discussion of the leagues and Constantine's role. As for the Indian presence, that comes quite a lot later. So it doesn't feature so much in the book, but it's a very I think important case study in unraveling these issues of where identity counts and where a more kind of prosaic explanation about money and performance kind of explains the presence of the racialized subject such as Constantine.
All right. Thank you, Lawrence. And Stephen, you want to go ahead?
Oh, I want to say congratulations, Michael, on the book. I'm really
Thank
looking
you,
forward
Stephen.
to reading it. I wondered about the connections that you can make between the local and the international. And I was thinking of Basil
Mm,
D'Olivera, and in '68, I think. And
mm,
as the kind of figure you're talking about, who is coming from the Commonwealth as a racialized
mm,
person, and then
mm,
their race is defined by their international career. So I'm just wondering about issues. I know this is kind of getting to the political, but
mhm,
issues such as apartheid and how they actually kind of define either the local cricket or national cricket and then
mm.
international cricket.
Yeah, okay, that's a really great question, Stephen. Thank you so much. And I'll try to answer that in relation to the West Indies and England, as it were. And I'll preface my answer, if I can, by returning to that historiographical problem, which is that the overwhelming emphasis in the literature about cricket, and particularly the sort of popular perception or interpretation of those historical writings, is through a Jamesian lens, particularly developed by people like Sir Hilary Beckles, a very, brilliant historian, Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, absolutely brilliant historian, but framing the rise of West Indies cricket as the rise of a kind of collective consciousness on the one hand, um, if not a national consciousness. I mean, the word national is often used in actual fact, but of course it's complicated in the West Indies context because um, it's complicated in the West Indies context because we're talking about a period of federation in the 50s and then the kind of, breakup of that federation and the emergence of separate island nation states. But one of my kind of criticisms, as it were, is that broadly understood, that sort of national lens has dominated our understanding of the relationship between the West Indies and England. And this slide, which I was trying to get to, kind of gets to that particular moment. So this is a collage of images from 1976 when the West Indies national cricket team came to England and absolutely demolished England at their own game, quote unquote. And this is a moment at which cricket becomes intensely politicized, particularly around the way the game is played, and we get lots of recurrent tropes about kind of embattled whiteness and the unleashing of colonial savagery upon English batsmen. You can see the heavy bruising of the English batsman in the right hand picture there. And this is all over the front pages of the newspapers and so on. But it's an iconic period at which West Indies become tremendously dominant. And this image from 1950, the image of the Calypso cricketer, and this, by the way, is a staged kind of fake photograph where the AP photographer, after the West Indies won a match at Lord's for the first time in June 1950, said, oh guys, will you come onto the outfield and do that Calypso thing because everybody loves it. The idea of the Calypso cricketer was very heartening and familiar. It was about the Caribbean as a place of, rum and gay music. So the shift from the Calypso cricketer to the 1970s rise of the West Indies, and then the politicization of cricket through the rebel tours of South Africa and Viv Richards' kind of leadership of the anti-tour positions, Viv Richards' embracing of Rastafari and his kind of very kind of visceral embrace of that on the cricket field. All of those things have overshadowed actually the local. And what I'm trying to argue in the book is precisely that those national frames of understanding, the idea of cricket as the rise of West Indian anti-colonial consciousness and unity, is both adequate and inadequate at the same time. And what it's specifically inadequate for is capturing the complexity of the situation that the England-born or the young English black cricketers found themselves in. And I've tried in the book to take the idea of that aspiration to play cricket seriously, to take it as an important object of study. I think it's easy to have a degree of condescension and talk about, aspiration and excellence as being something that we're not particularly interested in the sporting domain again. But there is a whole generation of young black people born in England who are seeking to rise up through the structures of English cricket and play this game at the national level. And the only pathway that they have ultimately is to play for England. So people like Roland Butcher, who was actually born in Barbados, but was the first black man to play for England, was in a very ambiguous and ambivalent position. And I think the Jamesian lens does not really capture that kind of complexity and situation. So the latter chapters of the book are trying to bring out just how it felt through oral histories, just how it felt to be born to Windrush generation cricketers who built their sense of community around the rise of West Indies cricket. And yet they were the ones who were going to school every day or going to the local park or going to the club and trying to find a place as black and English, which is an incredibly difficult thing to be doing in the 1970s or the 1980s. But what I'm arguing is that because historically cricket, race, and Englishness are so deeply imbricated and constitutive of each other. And I am making that strong claim, by the way. I'm not just saying cricket is sort of an addendum. I'm saying that cricket is instrumental, that cricket is constitutive of English, particularly English masculinity. So the kind of almost interpolation of the black cricketer into that space is incredibly disruptive of that sense of what it means to be English and therefore by projection British. So you've got two things happening at the same time. You've got the international level, which we know a lot about, and then you've got the local level, which we know actually almost nothing about. In all my oral history work, so many times people said to me, we talk about these stories, we talk about how important the clubs were to us and so on, but nobody's ever written it down. And then, sadly, they would sort of look around the room and say, we're not going to be here forever. So how's it going to be written down? So that would be my kind of comment on the relationship between the international political and the local social cultural, absolutely interacting with each other, but in ways which I think have been obscured by the dominant paradigms of analysis to this point.
Thanks a lot, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen, for the question. Do we have any other questions? And so, Rory, is that your hand? You want to go ahead? Oh, you're on mute still. Sorry. Hold 1 second, Rory. Let me see if I can unmute you.
I'm trying to raise
Oh, it's
my
Krishan.
hand, but I can't quite raise my. Can I just use my raised hand?
Sure, Krishan, you go ahead, and then Rory will turn to you after that, okay?
Thanks. Sorry about that. Michael, I've just got a very general question. I grew up when I was very young, partly in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, and then later in India. So I experienced cricket both as a kind of imperial game, a game within the empire, and a game after the empire. By the time I got to India, it was independent. But the passion with which the Indians embraced cricket in that post-imperial period, intensifying as time went on. So it makes me wonder, was there any difference in the way cricket was seen when it was an imperial game and when it became a national game, a game of national, intense national rivalry, which is, I
Mm.
suppose, roughly where we are today? Is there any
Mm.
change in the relationship between cricket and the nation and the people as we move from empire to the post-imperial situation?
And then why don't
Well,
we
I
let,
mean,
sorry, Michael, to cut, why
yeah,
don't,
sorry, Rory.
Rory, do
Yeah.
you want to go ahead and ask yours and then you can answer both?
Hi, Rory.
Sure.
Nice to
Yeah.
see you.
Hello. Yeah. You remember, obviously, you
Yeah.
know, I contributed to the book and everything. My question's a bit really from slightly different angle. As you know, it's quite sad, really, that there are very few young Black British people playing cricket, you know, for England or whatever. Very thing. But on the opposite side, in football, there's, you know, it's not, when I say football, obviously I mean soccer, for
Mm.
American people. It's just
Mm.
gone, you know, completely the other way. Maybe the Black British population is 7%. The playing in like the Premier in the top four leagues is something like 30 to 40%. So there's been this almost meteoric rise, you know, in really, you know, over a relatively short period of time. I mean, I'm 70 and was watching football, you know, from a very early age. And it's just really a question. It's probably sort of left field question. I mean, is there a story there? You know, is there something that I find it amazing. I can't why that has grown so amazing. So that now when you look at the England football team, practically most of them are basically black. You know, you see very few white players, and it's that has happened in a relatively short space of time.
Mm.
I
Sure.
just wondered
Amanda,
if you had any sort of, you know, is that something that you might want to look at, or something that
well,
that
I think it's a really complicated question, actually, Rory, and it's a very, it's another kind of way of us thinking that these questions about sport and identity are very, very important in terms of understanding, frankly, any society. But what's interesting about that and how I can perhaps speak to that question briefly vis-a-vis the book and the research that I did is that I think in very complicated ways, the transition from cricket to football, soccer, is is one which speaks to the transition from the colonial hangover period to a more kind of post-colonial condition in actual fact. And the evidence that I would want to put forward in that sense is that quite a lot of the younger people that I spoke to through the oral history process expressed a deep ambivalence about the game of cricket. They were acutely aware of its imperial British overtones. They felt that, in some senses, although the West Indies cricket team was vanquishing England and that this was a sort of triumph against the former colonial master and the kind of transcendence of the colonial condition, that at the everyday level, there was still something very traditional and kind of colonial about the way that black people in England were playing the game. Too much deference, too much kind of placatory behavior. And some of them said, although the racism in football is so much more overt, we embrace football as a national working class sport in which black people will find a place. And it's a sort of embracing of the national as opposed to the imperial, because football cannot be really cast as an imperial game. It's cricket par excellence that is the imperial game. So, I mean, there are many reasons. I mean, obviously, money is is one big reason as well. It has to be just, it's pretty clear. But I think that the letting go of the cricket context is partly connected to sort of almost moving on from the colonial legacy. And Krishan, very briefly, because I think we have to
yeah.
wrap up smartly on the hour. In the Indian context, you talked about the transition from empire to nation. Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, cricket in India in, say, the 40s was seen as absolutely a colonial imposition, a sport which was, played by princes, literally. Um, and if it wasn't being played by princes, it was something which just exacerbated an entrenched communal division. So, as you probably know, there were lots of teams which were organized around religious lines. So there was the Hindu Gymkhana and the Muslim Gymkhana and the Parsi Gymkhana and so on and so forth. And Gandhi spoke out very strongly against cricket as a form of colonial culture which was alien to India, alien to its traditions, and inhibiting the development of national unity. So I mean that's quite sort of pronounced. It's not really until the 80s that cricket starts to become fully, I think, embroiled and intertwined with the emergence of new forms of Indian nationalism. I mean, of course, it's growing in popularity, but as some people might know, India won the World Cup in 1983. And then with the advent, of sort of new India, the rise of India as a global power, the power of Indian media, and again, money is a big factor in all this. Um, Cricket becomes, partly because of the success on the field, but cricket becomes almost co-constitutive of Indian dominance and a rise to kind of world power. In that sense, in terms of cricket being an integrating force, there is a strong parallel with the Jamesian argument about how things operated in the West Indies. For James, cricket is one of the primary ways in which the West Indian will be integrated into global culture. He sees cricket through empire as being part of a global culture. So that transition is very sort of stark and analytically resonant, as you point out. I'm aware that we probably have come to the end of our time.
No, that's excellent timing. Thank you so much. I would like to briefly thank everyone for coming. This was as I mentioned, our final session for the spring, but over the summer, we're going to be looking towards our fall schedule and putting that together. So if you are an NACBS member and you've got a book coming out, please do get in touch. Or if you know someone who's got a book coming out, encourage them to get in touch. But in the meanwhile, I hope that everyone will join me in thanking Michael and Guy. Thank you so much for your excellent questions as well.
Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate it. Have a good rest of the day, evening, wherever you are. Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks, everyone.